for joining us. I was half expecting no one to turn up, given the amount of deadlines I know I've got. So feel free to put your cameras on or not. Let the meeting's be recorded. So.
And if you want, during the presentation, if you want to use, so I'll be chatting away. If you've got like really important questions, then turn your mic off, or if you just want to kind of make a comment or whatever as I'm doing a talk, then use like the chat. And it could be helpful to kind of have those, and then we'll have some things to kind of start the discussion off. So just if anything sounds interesting or you have any questions, just pop them in the chat, or if it's kind of an important clarification or whatever, then you can just turn your mic off.
If you really don't want to do that, then just pop it in the chat and let me know that you want me to interrupt.
I've got two screens so I can see the chat as well as what's going on. Do you want to wait another minute or two, or should I get started?
I guess we can get started. I think everyone probably knows who Engineers Without Borders are, but since it's going on the website, I'll give a very brief introduction. So we're a student society that work to promote globally responsible engineering, which means using engineering for the good of people and planet. If there are any other questions, just pop them in the chat as well, and I'll try and answer them. And this is our third Engineering for Good talk. So I'll let Hannah introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Hannah Mottram. I'm a PhD student at the University of Sheffield. I'm based between geography and engineering. My research looks at rural electrification in Tanzania, mainly focused on solar mini-grids. You can, if you want to get in touch with me, that's my Twitter is @Miss Mottram. I used to be a teacher, or my email, Sheffield email, if you want to email me to find out any more about work or any kind of follow-up questions afterwards. So I previously spoke to some people from Engineers Without Borders a bit more about kind of some specific stuff about my project. So I thought I'd take a bit of a different angle on this talk and talk about what does good mean. So when we talk about engineering for good, we talk about kind of in the aims of Engineers Without Borders, but what does it mean to be good? So this also I found a video that the UN made about the projects that I spent quite a bit of time on. So I'm going to show you this video and then show you some of the pictures to kind of reflect on my experiences there, so we can think about. I've got a few other questions. These are just some pictures of kind of the different aspects of what kind of, when we talk about rural electrification, what that could mean. So you've got, obviously, in kind of the top left, a very kind of technical diagram that might be the kind of thing that some of you are familiar with, or below that, a slightly kind of simplified schematic of a kind of renewable energy mini grid, and then kind of moving towards looking at, on the right side, how are people actually kind of using electricity. And my project aims to look kind of across this. So I'm doing work both on the kind of technical side and on the modelling of looking at load profiles and consumer demand, and how does that affect how you plan the system, and also looking kind of at the other end, how do people use and understand electricity, and how are the development impacts of that distributed across the community. So a little bit of context first. So mini grids in Tanzania, there's about 120 of them, and around half of them are very small projects which are under 100 kilowatts. So you can see on the map on the right of the screen, there's quite a lot of hydro ones in the south, which are obviously tied to regions that have a kind of suitable environment for that. There's a few biomass ones, a couple of hybrid projects and solar projects, and that's where there's been the most growth recently, is in these solar projects that are in very remote areas. You can see the red lines on this map are the transmission lines of the national grid. So you see there's some huge areas that are not connected to the grid around here. But even the area that I was mostly working was up here near Tanga in the north east, and this is a very mountainous area. So even though the grid might not be that far, kind of as the crow flies, in terms of getting it to those locations, it's very difficult and very expensive because it's very difficult terrain. So I visited 6 projects in Tanzania for my research and did activities like focus groups, surveys, interviews, observations, and participatory activities, as well as collecting data on how people use electricity and collecting data from the system. So here we go. So I'm going to play you this video that hopefully works if I click on it. Yes. So this is a video made by the United Nations about the project that I went to visit. So as you're watching this, I want you to think about how are they presenting the project. Does it sound like it's good? And who is it that's benefiting from the project in the community? So hopefully we'll have to check. Nathan, can you tell me if the sound works when I do this? I know that can sometimes be an issue. Hopefully it works. Is that good?
Access to affordable and reliable electricity is vital for Tanzania's attainment of its social economic goals. UNCDF supports development projects aimed at expanding access to affordable, reliable, and clean energy. Access to electricity is especially difficult in Tanzania's northeastern village of Mpale in Korogwe district, where the mountainous terrain poses a technical challenge in deploying grid lines. Together with project developer ENSO, the solar power microgrid has been able to supply power to 250 households, public facilities, and small businesses. Naweza kusema kwamba kama tusingepata fedha kutoka UNCDF, labda huu mradi usingefanikiwa, kwa sababu tulikuwa na vyanzo vingine pia vya fedha tulipata, lakini vilikuwa vinatolewa kwa mtindo wa matokeo kwanza. Ufanya jambo fulani alafu ndio unapata fedha. Sasa UNCDF walitusaidia kuweza kufungua hizo fursa zingine za kupata fedha zingine, kwa maana tuliweza kupata fedha ambazo zilitusaidia kuendelea kufanya shughuli za mradi wakati tunasubiri kupata fedha za kufanya mradi kutoka kwenye vyanzo vingine. The project is the first of its kind in the country to employ the Energy Daily Allowance System. The EDA system assigns a daily fixed amount of electricity to each household. This amount is calculated and agreed upon with each household based on the number of appliances that are to be powered through the mini-grid during a 24-hour cycle. To ensure affordability and value for money, the Mpale Solar Village Grid project uses a multi-tier tariff structure where different categories of energy users have different tariffs. This has created allowances for existing businesses to scale up their productivity and their income. Mimi binafsi imesaidia kwa sababu badala ya kutumia randa sasa ya zamani ambayo inatumia nguvu kubwa sana, sasa hivi natumia randa hii ambayo inaendeshwa na nishati hii ya umeme kwa sababu ya kusaidia nguvu yangu zaidi. Kwa hiyo inanirahisishia kwamba kazi inaweza kuchukua siku nyingi inaweza kuchukua siku chache. Hii lazima iwe inabadilisha kipato changu, kwa sababu vitu kama unavyoviona hapa Nimetengeneza vingi, nimeuza. Kwa hiyo na mimi nikaona ni kitu gani ambacho naweza nikafanya cha kuweza kuniingizia kipato au pia kitakachogusa jamii kwa ujumla. Nikaona kitu ambacho kitagusa jamii ni mambo ya saluni, kwa sababu kwa kiukweli wanawake huko wanapenda kujipodoa na wanapenda kupendeza. Kwa hiyo nikaona ni nini sasa niwape. Nikaona kitu cha kuweza kuwa huduma nitakaweza kuwahudumia ni mambo ya saluni, kwa sababu toka mwanzo saluni ambayo ipo katika tarafa nzima ilikuwa iko Bungu tu peke yake. Kwa hiyo ina maana sasa hivi katika tarafa hii ya Bungu ambayo ina kata 9, sasa hivi tuna saluni 2, yani na Mpale ikiwepo, ambayo ndio iko hii Mpale na kuna nyingine ambayo iko Bungu. Kwa hiyo hii inasababisha hata watu wa kata mbalimbali wanakuja kupata huduma katika kata hii ya Mpale, na hiyo yote inasababishwa na nini? Na umeme uliopo hapa ambao unatokana na watu wa ENSO. The success of the project in providing electricity is also attributed to the participatory meetings between local government leaders and the community. Mabadiliko yakitokeza, hata familia sasa ajua kwamba tulikuwa tunasikia umeme huko na salamu Korogwe, lakini sasa kumbe tuko hapa sana. Kama ile ilikuwa watu wanatumia taa karabai, lakini sasa pale masaa yote umeme wanatunza dawa. Kwa hiyo ni fursa ambayo imejitokeza kwa nini umeme. The project has created many opportunities in the areas of an improved business environment, economic growth, and social service delivery in schools and clinics. The Pale dispensary, for example, caters to more than 300 patients per month. Consistent power has meant a significant reduction in running costs. Consistent power has meant an almost 50% reduction in running vital services like vaccinations, which in turn have meant less costs for patients for the same services. Sasa baada ya kupata umeme, kwanza tunashukuru umeme kwamba wakati wote, yani wakati wote unaona. Kwa hiyo free inafanya kazi vizuri, na ukijaribu kuangalia sasa gharama kwenye gesi ilikuwa tunatumia almost 70,000 kwa mwezi, lakini sasa hivi umeme tunalipa shilingi 36 kwa mwezi. Kwa hiyo gharama zimefanya nini? Zimepungua. The performance of students at school has improved. Students are now able to take on more extracurricular studies through night learning. The Pale Solar Microgrid project is an excellent example of how unlocking public sector finance is just as important as unlocking private sector finance. Nashukuru kwamba hali ya Mpale imebadilika, sio kwa mimi tu, ila kwa baadhi ya watu mmoja mmoja, na kwa wengine pia wanaona, kwa sababu usiku ni kama mchana.
So that's a video that was made in the village that I did my field work by UN. Oh, don't want that. So these are some questions that I'd like to kind of reflect on that video, and then I'm going to show you a slideshow of some pictures that I took whilst I was in the village. So if you've got any reflections on these, you can kind of type them in the chat. So looking at this project, how well do you think it's meeting these two? So at the end of that video there was mention of the Sustainable Development Goals. So Sustainable Development Goal 1 is to eradicate poverty, and Sustainable Development Goal 7, the target on energy access is to ensure universal access to affordable, reliable and modern energy services. So how well is this project meeting those goals? And kind of for you personally, how would you consider a project to be good or successful? So would you consider this project that I'm kind of talking to you about to be good or successful, and how would you measure that? And then the third question is, whose opinion of what is good or successful is important? So my photos, and I'll talk a bit what some of these show. I think this is, yeah. I put in a mix of photos here to show you just some of like what kind of everyday life is like in the village. So this is from the market day. So a lot of people in the village earn money from agriculture. So for people with larger amounts of land, that's from farming tea, sugarcane, bananas, and some spices. And then also from doing kind of garden vegetables and fruits. So the green things there are oranges and kind of okra, which are sold at the market. But a lot of people's incomes are very low, and also they kind of change both during the seasons. Obviously, when there's different harvest seasons, they'll have more money when things are being harvested. But then are also dependent on how well things sell. So are they able to sell things at market, and on aspects of the weather and the climate, which people have noticed a change in. So last October, there was a lot of really heavy rains that meant people lost their entire bean crops and their plants were just washed away. So things like that can make people lose a significant amount of their income. This is my friend Mariam. So most people, the majority of households still cook on a open fire. This is a 3-stone, so there's 3 stones and you make a fire in the middle, and women, always the women, spend hours collecting firewood every week. Sometimes the men help with chopping it, but so kind of back-breaking work, collecting firewood, and then we'll also spend hours in their kitchens. Mariam had built her kitchen relatively recently, but I'll show you what some of the other ones look like in terms of the environment. I was helping Mariam because she was cooking our lunch, and I struggled to be in there for more than kind of 10-15 minutes without needing to go outside because of the smoke from the fire. But whereas women and children will be in there for hours a day. This is showing so people who don't have access to electricity, so no one cooks on electricity. Some people who are wealthier have access to gas, which did include me in the house that I was staying in. We had a small gas and kind of camping stove. But for people who don't have electricity, what they do use for lighting is kerosene. So they might have lamps like this that are a bit safer, but mostly it's kind of lamps like this that are made out of tins. So they're not particularly safe. And the kerosene is quite expensive, but you can buy it every day and you can buy as much as you need. So this is a woman, she was showing me the appliances that she had, so she didn't have access to electricity. That's the village again on market day. It's a beautiful, like, colourful place. I do have a collection of fabrics that I bought when I was out there. And you can see the pylons here from the mini grid. So this is like the centre of the village with the health centre and the school nearby. This is the head teacher of the school. So a lot of the people who've been able to set up businesses. So the woman in the video who was talking about her hair salon is actually the government officer for the district, or like the ward. So not just the ward, not just that village. She's the officer for that kind of a larger area. And this is the secondary school head teacher. So these are the people who are more likely to be able to set up their own businesses. So he set up a kind of electronics shop where he would he would sell various things and would also fix people's phones and gadgets and kind of things like solar torches. So some people would also have like solar lamps or just battery torches that they would top up every day, or that they would pay to charge at a neighbour's house who had electricity. This is guy who runs a shop. This is the shop that we used to go to most often. So he's he's got a freezer, which generally was just kept as a fridge, but he'd just only turn it on sometimes. So you had kind of cold drinks as well as having the other kinds of things you can see there that you could get in the village. So you've got, these are big bags of like rice and sugar. So people could buy those in really small quantities, depending on what you could afford to pay that day. And you can see kind of tiny bags of things like, some of these are herbs and spices, and some of them are biscuits and things like that, and snacks, and big bottles of oil. This is a woman cooking in the kitchen. So her house did have electricity, but they chose to not put it in the kitchen. So she's cooking by a small solar light, and this one you can see a little bit better how dirty the air is from seeing what's kind of reflected in that light, and how that's affected like the walls. There's like a real big build-up of soot on the walls, and really dirty. Also affects kind of, you can see people love having their colourful clothes, but the clothes get dirty, both using the kerosene lights and cooking on firewood. So this is some women. So the mini grid project, you know, is right on the top of that hill, just there with the wires going up to it, and this is the secondary school. This is a group of women carrying firewood. So women do this for several hours a day, and children, you can see there's a younger person just there, and carry it on their heads. I tried to carry, like, that's a lot of wood. I could not carry that on my head or in any other way. Like, I tried to lift something that someone had carried, and I couldn't even like lift it up, let alone put it on my head. And there's also kind of environmental impacts. Women are talking about having to go even further afield to find wood they can chop down, and obviously kind of chopping firewood affects like the impacts of when there are these floods. If you don't have woodland and trees, then the effects of flooding are going to be quite a lot worse. This is my friend Twalibu. So he's a tailor. So his sewing bag, he did fix some trousers when I got a hole in the crotch. So this was a sewing machine before, and then as part of my research, we bought a few little appliances to the village, just so people could we could kind of see how people use them, and also as a way of kind of giving something back to the community. So you can see this was before, when it's one of these proper kind of singer style old-fashioned ones where you use your feet. But this is, you can see added on here is a engine, a little motor, like 100-watt motor that makes it go quite a lot faster. Obviously means you're not having to constantly kind of use your feet, that he was very happy with. And he also did some training for other people in the community, and in exchange for us giving him the motor, he kind of kept a diary of what he was doing with it, and also gave training to some other people on about kind of how to use it. There was another tailor who we gave one to who hadn't used one before, so Twalibu kind of helped him out a bit. So this is an example of, there was a man doing a bit of the firewood work, but kind of chopping up the wood. So it's quite a lot of work. And you can see there's a kitchen just here, which is pretty dark because of the soot, but the rest of the house has got electricity. And these buckets here that I think come into another picture. So another thing which isn't, there isn't electricity being used for, is for water. So again, women and children fill up these buckets, which are 20 litres, maybe bigger. Fill them up, they walk to a kind of high point on the river where they can access clean water, and then balance them on their head again, and bring them back to the village, and spend hours doing that kind of every day. So here's another example of a kitchen. This is a house who don't have access to electricity at all. They have like a small torch. It's very dark inside, and lots of smoke damage. So one of the other things electricity is used for in the community is for showrooms. So some people can afford TVs, but a lot of people can't. But what they can do is pay. So they'll pay, what is it, kind of 10p, which is quite a significant amount of the kind of local income, to go and watch. They do have different things on, like they might play the football in the evening, which would be largely the men, but in the daytime, the women and children would come and watch kind of, I think this was a kind of soap opera. but it's quite a lot of people watching on TV. But it is an important way, and having radios as well, people having access to like news and other information. This is a milling machine. So electricity is mostly used for kind of small businesses, which they talked about bringing income from the surrounding villages. But those are villages that don't have electricity. But what it doesn't do is bring income in from other areas. So these other villages that don't have services like hair salons or TV showrooms, or they might have them but not powered by a mini grid, just by diesel generators. Those other villages are losing some of their money to this village. So there's kind of creating inequality between this village and the neighbouring ones. And it's not bringing income in from elsewhere. And a lot of the people who are earning income, they might spend some of it in the village, but quite a lot of it they'll spend on, you know, buying things like TVs and phones, which will go out of the village. But so this is a milling machine, which is using diesel because there's not currently a milling machine. Like, it's something people are working on that will work because it needs a high startup current that will work on this kind of system. But it's also something that's a very local business. People, like households, take their corn, maize, and then they get it milled into a flour. But you wouldn't travel particularly far for that. You just want to do it locally in your village. So this is someone who has got a compressor, so for doing motorbikes, and also kind of a nice TV. Well, kind of, you see, it's not a particularly efficient one. It's an old CRT rather than a flat screen, so not very efficient. Another kitchen. This one shows a bit better, so shows that it's, you know, women and children. So the children are quite often kind of on slings on their mothers' backs, and then we'll be in these kitchens, and you can see the smoke there quite clearly on the walls from the cooking. Another man with his business. Quite often men with businesses. They did choose one in the video, but mostly they are men. So he's got a small shop selling like bananas and drinks and has a sound system. This is what a house with a kerosene lamp looks like. So you see you've got a cooking fire in the background and a lot of smoke. And the amount of light that you get from them is not a lot. That was with a flash on. I do have another one that has, I'll find the one that has, it shows it. With, you know, how little light. That's with a flash on, which means you can see all of the smoke. And then another one, so this is children being in the kitchen with the water buckets that they'd be carrying, and yeah, the kind of smoke on the walls. So they talked about children studying, which is true. Children were able to study at night. But then there's also a limitation in that a lot of the houses didn't have electricity still. So in those houses, you're kind of you're creating more inequality because the children whose parents have got electricity have these additional opportunities. They're able to study at night. The school was doing something about this to sometimes run evening classes so that students could go and use electricity, like go and work under light in the evenings. But for a lot of children, that wasn't possible. If they lived further from the school, it wouldn't be safe for them to travel when it was dark, or they might be needed at home, you know, for helping with the cooking or with carrying wood or getting water or other things. So although it is a positive benefit that children are able to study, it isn't something that everybody, so less than half of the households in the village have got electricity. This is me, just another picture showing a bit of the mini grid, but also I wanted to give quite a bit more of a complete view of what the village is like. So children kind of love playing outside. They're kind of constantly playing. So I took bubbles with me and would run around using bubbles a lot of the time. I think that's not back to the start. That's another picture of the market. As you can see, the big firewood pile. The trees you can see in the background are banana trees. And this is a woman who has access to electricity, but you can see these big buckets on the floor that's what she would be carrying on her head with water in every day. And another task, so not everyone could afford, sorry, this picture's not very clear, not everyone could afford to get their maize milled by a milling machine, so they do it themselves. So that's a big stone bowl with a big wooden stick that you just grind up your maize in it. There was like a benefit, although, you know, so this is a hair salon, so although some households didn't have light, there would be light outside. So this is basically a kind of street light that meant that people could hang out, but obviously in the evenings, well, not obviously, but that was largely men who would benefit from that, although women reported that they would feel safer. Some people had access to charcoal, but not very many. That's a more kind of detailed view of a stove. It's a slightly different one where you can kind of have a warming pot, but they're still using, on the wall that you can see there, that's a one of these kerosene lamps. That's some women also doing kind of picking the tea on a farm. That's just a video. Actually, this one, yeah, this picture shows the kind of light you get from the kerosene lamp. So you can see it's not very bright, and so even though people have access to this sort of source of light, it's not very bright, and, you know, smoky and affects their health and things like that. And it's quite unsafe around children, because if you knock that over, the fuel in it is obviously flammable. So kind of a high risk of burns and things like that. So I've tried to pick out a few pictures that give you a bit more of a holistic idea of what the project is like and the kind of impact of it on the community. Because if you look at the video that you ended, so they are a funder, they're a donor, they've put out a message to say, like, this is kind of a great project. And it is, I mean, before, no one had electricity, well, the kind of grid electricity in this village, but actually in real life the context is a lot more complicated than that. So it's kind of met this need of ensuring access and kind of reducing poverty for some people in the village, but for other people it hasn't. And these projects, this project was implemented by, although it was funded by people like the UN and Power Africa, it's implemented by a private company who are putting a lot of risk into developing and kind of doing this project, but they need to make a profit on it still. So one of the things I'm looking at is kind of, what does that mean for communities, that these kind of companies who want to prioritize things like efficient use of the system and having tariffs that collect. So on a solar mini grid, you've got high fixed costs in terms of your solar panels, your batteries, your kind of distribution network, but your per unit cost of electricity, your kind of marginal cost of electricity is very low, because it's there already. Once you've got, you know, it's not like using gas or diesel or coal, where for every unit you've got to buy fuel, and so there's a cost to that. So they need to cover their fixed costs, but that leads to tariffs where, so they talked about this energy daily allowance tariff. So even people who are connected, the more appliances you've got, the cheaper your electricity is, because you can more efficiently use your daily allowance. Whereas for households who are just using it for light and phone charging, they can't afford other appliances, or they can't access financing for them, or they can't buy them. They end up paying a lot more per unit. They might be paying the same per month as someone who's also using a radio and a TV and has more lights. And I'm thinking, because these are solar projects, so you have the difference between you're generating a lot of electricity during the day, but then a lot of it is being used at night, because people are using it for their lights. So this project had a small time of use incentive to encourage people that it was slightly cheaper to use electricity in the daytime, because otherwise at nighttime it is more expensive, because you're having to use your batteries, and if you run them down you'll need to replace them quicker, and you need to kind of invest in kind of higher battery capacity. Other projects, it would be one project that I went to, it was twice as expensive at night as in the day. And if you've got a business or a shop, you can benefit from that lower tariff. But if you're just using electricity for basic things like having lights on in your house, you don't benefit from the daytime tariff, and you just have this like really high cost. Bearing in mind that project, it would be £2 per unit in the evening, and if you're connected to the main grid, it's 3p per unit all the time. So there's this big difference between people who are connected to the main grid or not. Yeah, so I'm interested to kind of hear your perspectives as well as what do you think makes a project being good or successful? So I did speak to some of like the engineers that were involved in this project, and I'd be like, oh, do you think this is a good project? And their response would be like, yes, the electricity is very reliable, and we don't have outages, which is one perspective, which is important, and people did really value that. So on the national grid, there's big issues with the distribution line and with load shedding, and it's rural areas that suffer first with those things because their use is less valuable, so they'd rather cut off some rural communities than cut off areas with industry. And also if there's any issues on the distribution network, it's both harder for them to get out to because they're further away, and it's a lower priority. So on the national grid, it's really low reliability. So it is something that people in this village appreciated, but it's not the only factor. Whereas kind of when I spoke to kind of the technician, that was what they said. They were like, yeah, it's good because it's reliable, we don't get these outages. And then you've obviously got the kind of the UN perspective, who are kind of highlighting, they want to show off their investments, which is good because there needs to be more investment in renewable energy and in energy access. But they're choosing to show things that show their kind of perspective, and hope you've seen from some of those pictures I've shown that there's a lot of things that aren't being met by this. So women, like there's nothing being used for clean cooking, and it's a global issue as well. Half of the population of the world, 3 billion people, cook using dirty fuels like charcoal or firewood, which is both a huge health issue, like it's bigger than a lot of diseases. I can't remember which ones it is that air pollution kills more than, and it's a big issue for children as well. And there's also whose opinion actually matters. So I've just seen that Happy Smiley said, asking the people it's supposed to help, which is, yeah, what I think is really important. What my approach to my research was to try and centre it. There's challenges around doing a PhD and having to tick the boxes of what the University of Sheffield wants me to do, because if I could have my way, I would just kind of not write anything else and just go back to the community and do workshops with them. But yeah, so asking people in the community, is this good? And they do say it's good, but it could also be better. And it's not meeting kind of all of these goals. Yeah, I've just seen there's another couple of questions. So the first one, so Happy Smiley, when it comes down to it, I think asking the people it was supposed to help is the best way to evaluate, because that's the ultimate goal of improvements like electricity grids. They're not an end in themselves. Yeah, and I think that's something that kind of can be sometimes in engineering, that you have a problem and there's a solution. Whereas actually when things are put into a context, it's a process. And it is really important to involve people from the start of that process, because otherwise you could be implementing something which isn't what people want. And one of the things with these projects is that they ask people, do you want electricity? And they say yes, because they want electricity. They don't have it, they want it. And they're like, yes, this will bring development to our community. But what they don't get asked is, how do you want it? And and it's still a company who are going to profit. So they didn't have a say in what the tariff structure would look like and how it would benefit the community in kind of broader ways. So there's also a level of how meaningful people's engagement is and who you ask. If you ask those people who have been able to set up businesses, like for that UN video, they went round and asked people who would give them the answers that they wanted to hear. Whereas yeah, I spent 2 months living in this village, and I visited a couple of times before that as well. Spent a lot of time building up trust with people in the community so that they would be honest and open with me. And whereas, you know, sometimes people will tell you what you want them, what they think you want to hear, and you can also choose who you ask, you can choose who you invite to these kind of meetings. There's things like wealthier people in communities are likely to be the ones who already have more power and have louder voices. So that's also more likely who you're going to hear when you do those kind of consultations. Holly's question, out of interest, were there many people in the community who weren't on board with the project? Yeah, there were quite a few at the start. The village chair, Ndoye, who was speaking in the video a bit, initially he was not in favour of it. And there's a couple of reasons for that. So the political context is difficult as well. And that's the thing about the kind of technology always exists in a context. So the local diwani or councillor, so kind of a level down from the member of parliament, I was in a meeting and he was telling people that the national grid is going to come, the national grid is going to come, like you just need to wait. And they've been saying that for 3 years and it's not coming anytime soon. So kind of there were people who weren't on board, but there was several reasons, and other people just weren't. I mean, some of the people who I spoke to who didn't have access were just like, I didn't go along to the meetings because I just knew I wouldn't be able to afford it, and you know, I didn't have time and things like that. So there was people who were actively against it, which was quite often for political reasons, but then there's other people who were just quite more kind of apathetic about it because it wasn't going to benefit them, and as it being a kind of private sector kind of company delivering the project, they had funding to pay for the connections, but then they want to connect the people who are going to use electricity. So it's not really, they want to connect enough people so that they can kind of have enough demand on the system, but they're going to prioritize connecting the people who have higher usage, and they're going to prioritize the people who've got businesses, the people who've got more money, rather than people who don't have any other alternatives, or they do have alternatives, but they're bad for their health. So the next question, Nathan, what sort of consultation do the project leaders do with local people prior to design? So this is, I've been trying to get this from this company, and they seem to have lost all of the documents, which suggests it wasn't that rigorous because they've lost the documents. I'll come to you after this, Isaac. But so it sounds like they did. So they asked quite simple questions almost, and their approach to my research was to be participatory, that I didn't go out there with a survey and a list of questions, because if you decide what questions you're going to ask when you go into a community, you're only going to get answers to the questions that you ask, which means you might completely miss things. So one of the things that came up through the conversations we were having was about this seasonality of income, and that it meant that some months people just couldn't afford to pay for electricity, so they went back to using kerosene lamps even though they had connections, which was something that hadn't come up in the company's planning, because you know, they'd ask questions like, oh, how much do you currently spend on kerosene? But the other point is that these people are currently having to choose, both when they're using kerosene and electricity, a lot of the poorer households are having to make a decision about whether they spend their money on that kerosene or that electricity, or on equipment for school, or on healthcare, or on clothes, or on other things. So even though they might be sometimes spending a certain amount, it doesn't mean that that's how much money they have to spend. So yeah, they did go, and they organize these meetings, but then there's who chooses to go to these meetings, who's heard in these meetings, and how they use that information. There can be, yeah, it's not always, and how open they are to different. So they decided what kind of tariff they were having, say, before they went into this. Isaac, you've got a hand up.
Sorry, hello. So I was just wondering, because you talked about the, I guess, the companies that were setting up these grids, and I don't know if it was entirely. I mean, I don't know to what extent it was intentional, but obviously painting them in a bad light. But I'm just curious.
They're taking a lot of risk in delivering these projects, and they are having benefits in communities. But I think the question is could it be done better?
Yeah. Okay, because yeah, I'm just wondering about what your thoughts are in terms of their aims in that. Are they, because they could obviously to an extent they need to be self-sustaining and so need to be profit oriented in some manner. But do they to what extent do they measure their success on social impact as well as profit? And do you think that needs to change for there to be better impact?
So basically, I was talking about this to my supervisor today. Basically, we need to get rid of capitalism. Or
just that small thing that needs to be sorted first.
Just a little thing. But I mean, I am looking at this in kind of a broader context of this kind of idea of marketization of development. And I mean, these companies are trying to do good, but at the end of the day, they are companies and they are driven by needing to deliver to shareholders. And what is something that I'm kind of looking at is that these, big donors, people like the Department for International Development, which maybe no longer exists. They moved it. They merged it with the Foreign Office, didn't they? Which is even more frustrating because it means it's going to be that money. Before, at least, it was Department for International Development. Now it's going to be used more for furthering the UK's interests because it's based out of the Foreign Office. But people like Department for International Development, USAID, people like this, they are really pushing this, that it should be the private sector who kind of deliver this because states are being very slow in their process. But by focusing on the private sector, you're going to have these difficulties because, like, to make the tariffs be more kind of economically efficient, you charge things like fixed costs. You charge more for it to be at night, which means you're not delivering access in an affordable way to the poorest people. So yeah, there's bigger kind of policy questions around the role of the private sector in delivering, especially basic services. Similar debates going on in like water and housing, of what's the role in the private sector in delivering those things. Like in the UK, we have had privatization, but we have quite strong regulations around. But it doesn't mean there aren't people like in the UK now in winter who can't afford to heat their houses and things. Yeah, it's bigger questions around, should those things be like provided by the state or should they be provided by the private sector? Because when kind of development is marketized and like the private sector put it front, services aren't delivered to the people who need them most. They're delivered to the people who can most easily afford to pay. So I do think these companies are acting in, for companies, what is the kind of logical maybe way. It's a commercial logic, but they're acting in the way that companies act, and they are being, they are doing things, when they've been delivering these projects, they've been providing connections for free to the health centre and to the school, and they have been working with the community, but at the end of the day, they're companies. And yeah, it's kind of questioning as well the role of companies. And I mean, then you do get into things like capitalism and global inequality, because the reason that, why can't the government fund this kind of infrastructure development? It's because of unfair trade laws and things like that. But I do have to stop it somewhere with my PhD project. But yeah, it's difficult.
So if I could just follow up quickly. So what do you think would be next? Do you think there needs to be a stronger partnership between private companies and, say, government to provide the grid on a more like welfare basis? Or
yeah, and so one of the things I've been looking at is the impact of these different tariffs. So there are tariffs that are like significantly worse for people who are poor in communities. So yeah, like policies need to be looked at, whether you could have kind of regulation, and definitely like greater involvement of communities and greater the kind of participatory approaches of not just asking the questions that you want to ask, but really kind of listening and understanding the communities. But it does also just come down to this kind of inequality of money, which is why it's quite sad, because when I'm trying to write my PhD, I'm like, I want like a positive answer, and then I'm like, what I've got is we need to sort out global inequality, because that's why the Tanzanian government can't fund kind of infrastructure. And it seems crazy when, in the UK we've had like 100% energy access for decades. The first, I can't remember when it was, the first like mini grid, It's been around for like hundreds of years. You know, I watch like old TV shows, and it's just crazy that you're like, there's countries where people are still like don't have access to kind of safe, clean sources of light, and you know, we're here like with like so much technology and so many things like that. Yeah, it's hard. But I think it's also a thing about not, in terms of coming back to Engineers Without Borders and things, about it, we do need people to be doing good things, and you know, every time that like solar panels get more efficient, that makes them more affordable and does kind of help these kind of solutions be able to be implemented better, you know. So like these kind of little, well, slight step changes, but sometimes quite big in terms of the progress in things like battery storage and solar panels. But that can't be it on its own. That needs to be alongside kind of global policy change. So kind of, although it's good to kind of have jobs that are kind of working and kind of doing work that's in a positive direction, we also need to be kind of pushing for these bigger changes that mean that things do better. So at the moment, there's been a positive change in the Department for International Development in that no UK foreign aid will no longer be used to fund fossil fuel projects. But they're also talking about cutting the 0.7%. So the UK aid budget is currently 0.7%, and they're talking about cutting that. So that's something you could like write to your MP about, or you know, because there's huge inequality in finances in the world, and things need money, unfortunately. Or yeah, we could also abolish capitalism, but that's a big project as well. The Energy 2050 group is a group. So it was where I was based in engineering, but then I moved and I've been involved more with people in chemical and biological engineering. So it's a network of mostly research level. Gotta say they're a bit kind of, it's mostly engineers, but there are people working on other aspects of energy at Sheffield. There's Vanessa Castamboto works on urban energy in, so she's based in the Urban Institute mostly in Mozambique, but also some other countries. She just started a big project. There's Ankit Kumar also in geography, who looks at most of his work's been in India. He did a lot looking at kind of people's relationship with light. Someone called Enora Robin, who's working in West Africa. So there's quite a few other people kind of across the university who are working on energy. But yeah, the Energy 2050 group is kind of an engineering group who do stuff. Nathan, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I thought for the benefit of EWB Sheffield's affiliation agreement to the national charity, I should probably say that whilst abolishing capitalism might be the viewpoint of some of the members, it isn't a group-wide viewpoint. And also, I had a question moving away from the sort of policy quagmire a bit.
Yeah.
Like in the UN video, it said that the energy was distributed to the houses, to the like businesses, individuals. How was that done? Did a 5-person household get the same as a 4-person or 6-person household?
So people would pay. So the lowest tariff was like £3 a month, which is, I'm just going to get a spreadsheet up quickly, which for a low-income household is this one, 11.2% of their income. So although £3 a month doesn't sound like very much, that's more than 10% of your income spent on electricity, which means it's eating into money that you would otherwise spend on food, on healthcare and education. And that would give you 0.275 units of electricity per day, which is plenty for using lights. I can show you some, it's in here. in terms of just getting an idea of what people use. I use this to do some analysis. So a low usage household would use about 0.57 kilowatt hours per week. So that's 0.5. So that's like well under their, so they get 0.275 kilowatt hours per day. So well under, but they only have those appliances of like lights and households. So for most households, that would be the same. And then looking at a medium usage household, so this is someone who's got lights. They've got some lights on all night for security, charging phones, TV, radio, speakers. That's 3.55 units per week. And if you use more than the 0.275 a day, you could go up to like the next tier that would be double that. But most people, most households were just on this 0.275 units per day, and that would be kind of enough for kind of basic usage. So that's another thing that they had these tiers. Initially, they were going to start at the 20,000, which was like £6 a month. But then people, that would have been 20% of a like low income household's income. But after consultation, so that's what I mean about kind of what consultation did they do? Because initially they were going to do that as the lowest tariff, and actually a lot of households are on the lowest tariff that they've got, but are using a fraction of their energy. And just bear in mind, like I think in my house we use like, so that's in a week with like we use maybe like 2 or 3 units a day in terms of having lights, having computers, having the washing machine and those sorts of things. So people aren't using that much electricity, but they're paying quite a lot for it.
It's really interesting. I guess if there are any more questions, now is the time to ask them. So it's getting up to 7 o'clock when we normally wrap up. People are a minute or so to.
But if you do have any questions, I'll go back to my, if it'll let me. Yeah. You can, if you're kind of interested in kind of work. I've also, so I previously worked in UK government, the Department of Energy, Climate Change, and at the Office for Gas and Electricity Markets, and working in the charity sector on energy access before I started my PhD. So if anyone's interested in kind of talking to me about those kind of careers and things, then I'm happy to kind of talk to you about. I've also been a teacher about a range of different things. So please just, you can find me on Twitter or send me an email.
I guess a question that might benefit multiple people in this group is just if you were interested in this kind of thing, what particular sources or resources would you go to or use to maybe learn a bit more about it and so
on? There's a journal that I use quite a lot that's called Energy Research and Social Science, which like you can look at the titles of the headings, and like that includes both like UK and international research, but being kind of social science, it means that stuff's a bit more contextual, whereas if you look at just kind of energy engineering papers, they won't be as kind of context specific. So I'd say that's a good journal to look at, and you can just look at kind of the titles of papers and read whatever sounds interesting. There are some of the NGOs, people like Practical Action, IIED, I can't remember what it stands for, and ODI, which is the Overseas Development Institute. They do kind of have publications and things that are kind of interesting to read and kind of quite accessible. So that's probably a couple of places that I would start.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you for the talk. It's really interesting. It's good to examine what we mean by good after sort of listening to all the previous talks, and also good to remember that technology always exists in a context. I'm sure there will be more of these engineering for good talks after in the new year, once I've organised them. But thanks everyone for coming. If you haven't had enough of Engineers Without Borders, we've got an event tomorrow that is the sort of last part of our Green Careers Fair series with a guy from Notpla who do like biodegradable packaging, and that's a bit earlier. That's at 5. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming, and yeah, thanks again, Hannah, for the talk. And have a good Christmas and
Thank you.
Hanukkah, everyone.